The morning my HOA president tried to steal my Jeep started with the sound of metal snapping. Not a small sound either. A loud, sharp clack that echoed through the quiet neighborhood like someone breaking a chain. At first, I thought maybe someone dropped a tool outside, but then I heard voices, and one of them I recognized immediately. Karen. And if you've ever lived in an HOA neighborhood, you already know exactly the kind of person I'm talking about. I walked over to the window and peeked through the blinds. My Jeep was parked exactly where it had been the night before, backed neatly into my driveway. But Karen was standing next to it, and she was holding bolt cutters. That was the moment I realized this was about to become a very long morning. But to understand how we got there, you need to understand the neighborhood I had just moved into and why Karen had been watching my Jeep like it personally offended her existence. I moved into the neighborhood about 3 months earlier. On paper, it seemed like a great place. Quiet streets, clean houses, families walking dogs in the evening. The kind of place real estate listings describe with phrases like peaceful community living. What those listings don't mention is the HOA. Now, I've dealt with homeowners associations before. Usually they're just mildly annoying, sending emails about lawn height or trash bins. But this one had Karen. Karen was the HOA president, and she took that title the way some people take military rank. Clipboard in one hand, rulebook in the other, constantly patrolling the neighborhood like she was guarding the gates of a high-security prison instead of a suburban cul-de-sac. Within my first week of moving in, I had already heard multiple stories about her. She had fined someone for leaving their garage door open too long. She had reported a neighbor because their mailbox was the wrong shade of white. And apparently she once tried to ban someone's pickup truck because it looked too commercial. So yeah, Karen had a reputation. At first, though, she didn't seem too interested in me. That changed the day my Jeep arrived. Now, my Jeep isn't exactly subtle. It's a dark, lifted Wrangler with reinforced bumpers, heavy-duty tires, and a few pieces of equipment mounted inside that most people wouldn't recognize unless they worked in law enforcement. But to the average neighbor, it just looks like a serious off-road vehicle. I parked it in my driveway the same way anyone else would park their car. And apparently that was my first mistake, because the next morning I walked outside and found a bright orange notice tucked under the windshield wiper. It read, "Unauthorized vehicle," or, "Revealee required." I actually laughed when I first saw it. I assumed it was some kind of mistake, but then, later that afternoon, Karen showed up at my door. She didn't knock politely either. It was one of those rapid-fire, authority-style knocks that immediately tell you someone thinks they're in charge. When I opened the door, she was standing there with a clipboard and a tight smile. "You must be the new resident," she said. I nodded. Then she pointed toward the driveway. "That vehicle is in violation of community regulations." That vehicle is in violation of community regulations. I looked past her at the Jeep. What regulation? Karen flipped through her clipboard like a lawyer preparing evidence in court. No commercial vehicles, no government vehicles, and no vehicles that appear to be used for enforcement purposes. I raised an eyebrow. "Appear to be." She gave a smug little shrug. "If it looks suspicious, it requires HOA approval." Now, at this point, I could have explained everything, but instead I kept things simple. "Karen," I said calmly, "the Jeep is allowed to be there." She crossed her arms. "Not according to the rules." I paused for a moment, then gave her a polite warning. "Look, I'd strongly recommend not touching that vehicle." Karen's smile returned, the kind of smile people get when they think someone just made a very bad bluff. "Well," she said, turning to walk away, "we'll see about that." And over the next few weeks, she made it very clear that she intended to do exactly that. What Karen didn't realize was that my Jeep wasn't just a Jeep. and the moment she decided to mess with it, she accidentally stepped into something far bigger than HOA politics. 3 days after Karen showed up at my door with that clipboard, I walked outside and immediately knew she wasn't done with me, because there were 2 new notices on my Jeep. Not 1, 2, both bright orange, both stamped with HOA violation, and both placed very carefully under the windshield wipers like they were official parking tickets. I stood there in the driveway for a moment just staring at them, already knowing exactly who had put them there. Karen didn't strike me as the type of person who believed in second chances. She believed in paper trails. I pulled the first notice free and read it. Unauthorized vehicle under investigation. Removal may be required. The second one was even better. Possible government or enforcement vehicle, not approved by HOA board. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was ridiculous. Apparently Karen had decided that my Jeep was some kind of secret police vehicle infiltrating the neighborhood. And the best part, and she had absolutely no authority to do anything about it, at least not legally. But Karen wasn't the type of person who cared much about limits. She cared about control, and my Jeep had clearly become her latest project. Later that afternoon, I was in the garage, organizing a few things when I heard someone walking up the driveway. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I didn't even need to look to know who it was. Karen knocked on the side of the open garage door. Not politely, more like someone knocking on the door of a business they were about to file a complaint against. When I stepped out, she was standing there with the same clipboard and the same expression she had worn during our first conversation. Confident. Certain. Like she had already decided she was right. "Did you receive the violation notices?" she asked. I held one up. "These?" She nodded. "Well, see." She nodded. Yes. Your vehicle has been flagged for review." Flagged by who? The HOA board. Now here's the thing. I had already spoken to 2 neighbors on the board earlier that week. Nice people. Pretty reasonable. And neither of them had mentioned anything about my Jeep being a problem. So I had a feeling Karen might have been stretching the truth a little. "What exactly is the issue?" I asked. Karen looked past me toward the driveway, where the Jeep was parked. "That vehicle has several features that suggest it may be used for government or enforcement purposes." I crossed my arms. "Suggest?" She nodded. "Yes. The bumper modifications, the interior equipment, the mounting brackets." Now that got my attention, because that meant she had been looking inside my vehicle, closely, a little too closely. "That's an interesting observation," I said slowly. Karen didn't notice the change in my tone. "In this community," she continued, "we do not allow law enforcement vehicles, commercial vehicles, or surveillance vehicles without HOA approval." Surveillance vehicles. I almost asked her where she got that idea, but then I remembered something one of the neighbors had mentioned earlier. Karen loved erratic conclusions. If something looked unusual, she assumed the worst possible explanation. "So what exactly do you want me to do?" I asked. Karen flipped another page on her clipboard. "The board will likely require the vehicle to be removed from the property." I let that sit for a second. "Removed?" "Yes. And if I don't?" Karen smiled again. The same smug little smile she had used during our first conversation. "Then the HOA has the authority to take corrective action." Now at that moment, I realized 2 things. First, Karen genuinely believed she had the power to control what happened to that Jeep. And second, she had absolutely no idea what she was messing with. So I decided to give her one more chance to walk away from this situation. "Karen," I said calmly, "I'd strongly recommend leaving that vehicle alone." She tilted her head slightly. "Is that supposed to be a threat?" "No," I said. "It's a warning." For the first time, there was a brief moment of silence between us, but Karen broke it quickly. "Well," she said, while writing something down on her clipboard, "if the vehicle isn't removed within 72 hours, the HOA will escalate the situation." Then she turned and started walking back down the driveway. Before she reached the sidewalk, she stopped and looked back over her shoulder. "Oh, and just so we're clear," she added, "if that vehicle is part of some kind of government operation, you'll need to provide documentation to the HOA. I shook my head slightly, because Karen had just unknowingly walked right past the safest option she had. If she had simply dropped the issue right there, none of what happened next would have happened. But Karen wasn't interested in backing down. She was interested in proving she was right. And over the next few days, she started making phone calls, filing reports, and trying to convince half the neighborhood that my Jeep was some kind of suspicious government vehicle. The problem with that plan, she was about to prove herself more correct than she ever intended, and the moment she decided to take things into her own hands, everything was going to spiral completely out of her control. 2 days after Karen gave me her 72-hour ultimatum, I started noticing something strange. People in the neighborhood were staring at my Jeep. Not casually either. I'm talking about the kind of staring people do when they think something suspicious is happening. One guy walking his dog slowed down, looked at the Jeep, then looked at me like he was trying to figure out if I was secretly running some kind of surveillance operation out of my driveway. Another neighbor drove by twice in the same afternoon. The second time, he actually rolled down his window and asked, "Hey, is that some kind of police vehicle?" That's when I realized Karen had already started doing exactly what I expected she would. She had begun talking, and Karen didn't just talk. Karen campaigned. Later that evening, I found out just how far she had taken things. I was bringing groceries in from the car when my neighbor Tom walked over from across the street. Tom was a retired Marine who had lived in the neighborhood for years. Easygoing guy. The kind of neighbor who waves every morning and minds his own business. But that evening he looked, Ed slightly amused. "You got the whole neighborhood talking," he said. I set the grocery bag down. "Let me guess," I said. "Karen." Tom laughed. "Oh yeah, apparently earlier that afternoon Karen had gone door to door speaking with several neighbors, and according to her story, my Jeep wasn't just a rule violation anymore. Now it was something much bigger. She's telling people it might be some kind of surveillance vehicle," Tom said. I rubbed my forehead. "Surveillance vehicle? Yeah," he continued. "Said you might be running some kind of operation out of the neighborhood." I shook my head slowly. Karen's imagination had officially entered full conspiracy mode. "What else did she say?" I asked. Tom chuckled. "She said she contacted a towing company to remove it." That made me pause. "A tow company?" "Yep." "And?" Tom grinned. "They refused." Now that part didn't surprise me, because anyone who takes one good look at my Jeep usually realizes pretty quickly that it's not a normal tow situation. Heavy bumpers, reinforced frame, equipment mounted inside. Tow truck drivers tend to be smart about those things. They know when something looks like more trouble than it's worth. Apparently Karen had learned that lesson the hard way, but instead of backing down, she had decided to double down. The next morning I saw exactly what Tom meant. Karen was standing on the sidewalk across the street with 2 other members of the HOA board, and all 3 of them were looking directly at my driveway. Karen was talking rapidly, pointing at the Jeep like she was explaining a crime scene. Every few seconds she'd gesture toward the mounted equipment inside the vehicle. One of the board members looked confused. The other looked uncomfortable, but Karen looked determined. When she noticed me stepping outside, she immediately walked across the start, right toward my driveway. The other 2 board members stayed back. That was probably a smart decision. "Good morning," she said with forced politeness. "Morning?" Karen pointed directly at the Jeep. "We've completed our review." "That was quick," I replied. She ignored the comment. "The HOA board believes this vehicle violates multiple regulations." I glanced over at the 2 board members standing on the sidewalk. Neither one looked like they wanted to be part of the conversation. "So what happens now?" I asked. Karen's smile slowly returned. "The vehicle will need to be removed, and if it isn't..." Karen tapped the Jeep's lock steering wheel with her pen. "Then the HO will remove it." Now that statement caught my attention, because the Jeep wasn't just parked in the driveway. It was also secured with a heavy-duty wheel lock and chain, not something most people would bother with for a regular vehicle. Karen noticed me looking at the lock. "Oh, don't worry," she said casually. "We'll take care of that." There it was. The moment she crossed the line from threatening to planning. I took a slow breath. "Karen," I said calmly, "this is the last time I'm going to tell you this." Her expression hardened slightly. "You do not want to interfere with that vehicle." For a brief second she hesitated, but then the confidence came back. "Unless you can provide documentation proving it's authorized," she said. "The HOA has the right to enforce community standards." I shook my head, because Karen had just made a decision she didn't fully understand. She had convinced herself she was protecting the neighborhood, when in reality she was about to interfere with something far beyond HOA authority. Karen turned and started walking back toward the sidewalk where the other board members were waiting. Before leaving, she looked back over her shoulder and said something that would end up starting the entire disaster. "Well," she said confidently, "5 miles, Revide, the tow company won't remove it." Her eyes drifted down toward the lock on the wheel. "We'll just handle it ourselves." And at that moment, I knew exactly where this situation was heading, because Karen had officially moved past complaints, past warnings, past HOA paperwork. Now she was planning to take action herself. And when she did, she was about to make the single worst mistake of her entire life. The exact moment Karen crossed the line happened at 6:42 a.m. I remember the time, because I looked at my phone right after I heard the sound. Clack, metal snapping. The kind of sound you don't normally hear in a quiet neighborhood that early in the morning. At first I thought someone down the street might be working on a fence or cutting a bike lock. But then I heard voices outside my house, and one of them was loud enough that I recognized it instantly. Karen. That alone was enough to make me walk over to the window. But the second clack made me move a lot faster. When I pulled the curtain aside and looked out toward my driveway, the scene outside looked like something out of a ridiculous HOA nightmare. Karen was standing next to my Jeep, and she was holding a pair of large bolt cutters. For a moment I just stood there staring, trying to process what I was seeing, because surely she couldn't actually be doing what it looked like she was doing. But then she leaned down again, positioned the cutters around the thick steel chain that secured the wheel lock, and squeezed. Clack! The chain snapped open. That's when I grabbed my shoes and headed outside. By the time I stepped into the driveway, Karen wasn't alone. 3 other people were standing nearby. 2 were neighbors who looked extremely uncomfortable. The third was one of the HOA BOA members I had seen earlier in the week. But the star of the show was clearly Karen. She looked incredibly proud of herself. The broken chain was lying on the ground beside the Jeep, and the wheel lock had already been removed. When she saw me approaching, she straightened up and crossed her arms. "Oh, good," she said loudly. "You're awake." I stopped a few feet away from the Jeep. "What are you doing?" Karen gestured dramatically toward the vehicle. "As HOA president, I am enforcing community regulations." I looked down at the cut chain on the ground. "You broke my lock." Karen shrugged like it was nothing. "You left us no choice." Behind her, one of the neighbors shifted nervously. "This vehicle is being seized for violating HOA rules," Karen continued. Seized. She actually used the word seized, like she was some kind of law enforcement officer. I took a slow breath. "Karen," I said calmly, "step away from the Jeep." She laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, please," she said. "You've been pretending this thing is some kind of government vehicle for weeks." "I never said that." You implied it. One of the neighbors spoke up quietly. Karen, maybe we should just. She cut him off immediately. No, the board voted to remove the vehicle. That was interesting, because I knew for a fact the board hadn't voted on anything like that. But Karen had clearly decided that her decision was the same as a vote. I pointed down at the chain again. You understand you just destroyed my property, right? Karen rolled her eyes. Oh, relax. The HOA will handle it. Then she reached for the driver's door handle. That's when I stepped forward. Karen. She stopped, and for the first time that morning, my voice wasn't friendly anymore. You need to stop. She slowly turned around. And why is that? I looked directly at her. Because that Jeep is signed. Just a Jeep. Karen folded her arms again. Oh, really? Yes. Well then, she said smugly. What is it? There was a brief pause. I gave her one last chance to walk away from the situation. You really don't want to interfere with that vehicle? Karen smiled, the same confident smile she had been using since this whole situation started. Oh, I think I do. She grabbed the door handle again and pulled it open. That was the moment everything changed, because Karen had just gone from cutting a lock to tampering with something she absolutely should not have touched. I sighed and pulled my phone out of my pocket. What are you doing now? Karen asked. Calling someone. She laughed again. Let me guess, a lawyer. I shook my head. No. I looked down at the screen as the call connected. Not a lawyer. Karen was still smiling when I held the phone to my ear. But that smile didn't last long, because the person who answered that call was about to arrive in the neighborhood much sooner than she expected. And when they did, Karen was finally going to realize just how big a mistake she had made. The first warning sign wasn't the sound of the bolt cutters. It was the silence. You know that strange moment when a busy neighborhood suddenly goes quiet. Lawnmowers stop. Kids stop yelling. Even the wind feels like it's holding its breath. That's exactly what happened the moment Linda Kessler, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, marched into the parking lot. And she wasn't alone. Two members of the HOA board trailed behind her like nervous interns, clutching clipboards and whispering back and forth. One of them looked uncomfortable. The other looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else. But Linda? And Linda looked thrilled, because right in the middle of the visitor parking area sat the Jeep. Locked, tagged, and according to Linda, illegally parked. She stopped a few feet away from it, hands planted firmly on her hips. There it is, she announced loudly. Her voice carried across the courtyard like a courtroom verdict. That vehicle has been here for 3 days. 3 days. One of the board members cleared his throat. Well, technically it's been about 36 hours. Linda spun toward him. Bah. Don't correct me. The man immediately went quiet. From my second-floor window I had a perfect view of everything unfolding below. My coffee sat forgotten on the windowsill as I watched, because this was exactly what the task force had warned me about. Linda stepped closer to the Jeep, peering through the tinted windows. No parking permit, she muttered. No resident sticker. And look at this lock. She bent down and rattled the heavy chain wrapped around the wheel. Who chains a vehicle in a visitor spot? She scoffed. The other board member spoke carefully. Maybe someone who doesn't want it moved? Linda let out a sharp laugh. Oh, please. This is a violation, and I am not letting some random person turn our community into a junkyard. Then she turned dramatically toward the small group of residents that had started gathering nearby, because of course they had. HOA drama spreads faster than wildfire. Don't worry, everyone, Linda announced proudly. I'm handling it, and pulled out the bolt cutters. Even from my window I could hear the collective gasp ripple through the small crowd. One resident spoke up immediately. Are you sure you can do that? Linda didn't even look at him. As HOA president, I have full authority to remove unauthorized property. Another neighbor crossed his arms. But that chain looks serious. It did. The thick steel links wrapped tightly around the wheel weren't some cheap hardware store lock. It was heavy-duty, professional, and it definitely wasn't there by accident. Linda stepped forward anyway. "Well then," she said smugly, "we'll just see how serious it is." She positioned the jaws of the bolt cutters around the chain. The metal clanged loudly as she adjusted her grip. For a moment, the entire parking lot went completely still. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the two HOA board members looked unsure now. "Linda," one of them said quietly, "maybe we should call a towing company instead." She shot him a glare. "And wait 3 more days." "Absolutely not." Then she leaned her full weight into the cutters. Clang. The metal shrieked under pressure. Clang. The chain groaned but didn't break. Linda's face flushed red. "Oh, come on," she muttered, adjusting the tool again. Clang. Still nothing. A few people in the crowd began whispering, "Is that even legal? Should she be touching that? What if it belongs to someone?" But Linda was too deep in now. Her pride wouldn't let her stop. With a frustrated grunt, she raised the bolt cutters again and slammed them down onto the chain with everything she had. Clang. This time something happened. But it wasn't the chain breaking. It was the sound of a car door slamming nearby. Everyone turned. A black sedan had just pulled into the parking lot. 2 men stepped out. They didn't look like residents. They didn't look like HOA board members either. They looked serious. Very serious. One of them scanned the scene, the Jeep, the chain, the bolt cutters in Linda's hands, and then calmly reached into his jacket pocket. Linda didn't notice. She was too busy preparing for another swing. But the crowd noticed, and suddenly the whispers stopped, because the man from the sedan had just pulled out a badge, and he was walking straight toward Linda, fast. Very fast. Linda raised the bolt cutters one more time. And that's when the man shouted the words that made the entire parking lot freeze. "Ma'am, step away from that vehicle immediately." Karen's smile lasted exactly 9 seconds after I made that call. 9. That's how long it took for the first siren to echo down our quiet suburban street. At first it was faint, just a distant whoop, whoop, the kind of sound you hear miles away and assume it has nothing to do with you. Karen heard it too. She glanced toward the street, but didn't look worried. In fact, she smirked. "Did you call the police?" she asked sarcastically. "Because that's a little dramatic." I didn't answer. Instead, I slipped my phone back into my pocket and leaned casually against the fence beside my driveway. That's when the second siren joined the first, and then a third. The sound grew louder, faster, closer. Now Karen's smile faded a little. One of the neighbors shifted nervously. That sounds like a lot of police." Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh, relax. Probably someone speeding on the highway." But then the first black SUV turned the corner onto our street, and it didn't slow down. It came straight toward my house. Behind it was another SUV, and another. 3 vehicles rolled to a stop in front of my driveway like they had rehearsed it. The doors opened almost simultaneously. Karen blinked. 4 officers stepped out. Not regular patrol cops either. Another approached Karen. "Ma'am," the officer said calmly, "step away from the vehicle." Karen looked around in confusion. Excuse me?" I said, "Step away from the vehicle." Now the neighbors were fully invested. People had started coming out of their houses. Phones were up. Everyone was recording. Karen quickly switched back into her confident HOA president tone. "Officer, I'm actually glad you're here," she said. She pointed dramatically at the Jeep. "This vehicle has been illegally parked in our HOA visitor space for days." The officer didn't react. Karen continued. I'm the president of the Homeowners Association, and we're in the process of removing it. The officer glanced down, right at the cut chain lying on the ground. Then he looked back at her. You cut that lock? Karen hesitated for half a second. Yes, under HOA authority. One of the officers near the Jeep spoke into a radio. Vehicle confirmed. The words were quiet, but the tone was serious. Karen frowned. What does that mean? Another officer opened the Jeep door. He checked something inside. Then he nodded toward the others. Yep, this is the one. Karen crossed her arms. Well, good. Then you can have it towed. That's when the first officer looked at her again. This time his expression had completely changed. It wasn't neutral anymore. Now, it was the look someone gives when they're trying to figure out how a person managed to make such a bad decision. Ma'am, he said slowly, this vehicle is part of an active police task force operation. The entire street went silent. Karen blinked. I'm sorry, what? The officer gestured toward the Jeep. This vehicle is registered to a multi-agency task force conducting surveillance in this area. Karen actually laughed, like she thought it was a joke. Oh, come on. That's ridiculous. No one else laughed. The officer continued calmly. And you just cut the security lock on it. Karen looked down at the chain on the ground, then back at the officer. Well, how was I supposed to know that? One of the neighbors muttered quietly. Maybe because it was chained like Fort Knox. Karen ignored him. His is still HOA property, she insisted. You can't just leave vehicles here. The officer tilted his head slightly. Actually, we can. Another officer stepped forward, holding a small black case he had pulled from inside the Jeep. He opened it briefly. Inside were radios, documents, and a badge. Not just any badge. A federal badge? Karen's face went pale. The officer closed the case. Tampering with law enforcement equipment, he said evenly, is a serious matter. Karen's confident posture completely collapsed. I didn't tamper with anything. The officer pointed at the broken chain. You cut the lock. Karen looked around desperately, at the neighbors, at the board members, at me. But nobody told me. That's when I finally spoke again. I tried. Isp at brood members. At me. Karen stared at me. You said it was important. I said you didn't want to interfere with that Jeep. The officer turned back to her. Ma'am, we're going to need to ask you a few questions. Now Karen looked genuinely scared, because for the first time since this whole situation started, she realized something. This wasn't an HOA meeting. This wasn't a parking complaint. And this definitely wasn't something she could fix with a warning letter. She had just interfered with a police task force operation. And the consequences were about to get a lot more serious. Karen's confidence didn't disappear all at once. It collapsed, piece by piece. First, it was the smile. The moment the officer mentioned the words, active police task force operation, that smile vanished from her face like someone flipped a switch. Then came the silence. Karen looked around the street as if someone nearby would step in and confirm this was all some kind of misunderstanding. But nobody spoke. Not the neighbors. Not the neighbors, not the HOA board members standing awkwardly near the sidewalk, and definitely not the officers surrounding the Jeep. For the first time since this entire situation started, Karen looked uncertain. The officer crouched down and picked up the cut chain from the driveway. He held it up slightly. Did you cut this yourself? Karen swallowed. Well, yes. But I didn't know. And interrupted her gently. Ma'am, this lock was placed on the vehicle for a reason. Karen tried to recover her confidence, but it was parked in a visitor space. Our HOA has rules about that. A few neighbors quietly exchanged looks, because everyone knew Karen's HOA rules had just collided with something much bigger. I understand. Karen seemed relieved for half a second, then he continued. But HOA rules do not override law enforcement operations. That relief disappeared instantly. Another officer stepped forward, holding a tablet. He glanced at the Jeep, then back at Karen. Name? Karen blinked. Excuse me. Your name? Ma'am. Karen blinked. Excuse me. Your name, ma'am. Karen Whitmore. The officer typed something into the tablet. And you the one who authorized the lock to be cut? Karen hesitated again. But with half the neighborhood watching, there was no backing out now. Yes, I'm the HOA president. The officer nodded once. Then he looked at the other officers. Noted. Karen looked at me again, almost like she expected me to step in and help. But there was nothing for me to say. I had warned her. More than once. One of the officers opened the Jeep again and checked the equipment inside. Everything looks intact, he said. Good, the first officer replied. Then he turned back to Karen. Ma'am, interfering with law enforcement equipment and ongoing surveillance can carry serious penalties. Karen's voice suddenly got very small. I wasn't interfering, I was just enforcing parking rules. The officer looked down at the bolt cutters, still lying near he. Our feet. You cut a security lock on a vehicle registered to a federal task force. Karen stared at the ground. The realization was finally sinking in. The officer continued in a calm, almost instructional tone. Best case scenario, this is considered destruction of property. Karen's head snapped up. Destruction. He nodded toward the broken chain. You damaged security equipment. She looked like she might faint. But I can pay for that. The officer shrugged slightly. That part is the least of your concerns. Now the crowd started whispering again. Phones were still recording. Someone across the street muttered quietly, "Wow, she really messed up." The second officer finished typing on his tablet. Then he looked directly at Karen. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us to answer a few more questions." Karen's eyes widened. "Come with you? It's routine. But I didn't do anything criminal." The officer didn't argue. He simply gestured toward the police SUV parked at the curb. "We'll sort that out at the station." Karen turned toward the HOA board members like she expected support. Neither one met her eyes. They looked like two people who had suddenly realized they wanted no part of this situation. One of them even slowly stepped backward. Karen's voice cracked. "This is ridiculous. I was protecting the neighborhood." The officer responded calmly. "And we were protecting a task force operation." That was the end of the argument. As Karen walked toward the SUV with the officers, the neighborhood crowd parted to make room. No one said a word. The same neighbors who had listened to her HOA speeches for years were now just watching quietly. A few people even shook their heads. When the SUV door closed behind her, the first officer turned to me. "You the one who called?" I nodded. "Yes, sir." He glanced at the Jeep and smiled slightly. "Next time, maybe park it somewhere less HOA friendly." I laughed. "Believe me, I'm thinking about it." The officers finished checking the vehicle and then slowly packed up their equipment. Within minutes, the convoy of SUVs pulled away from the street. And just like that, the quiet neighborhood returned to normal. Except for one thing. For the first time in years, no one in the neighborhood was talking about parking rules. They were all talking about the day the HOA president tried to seize a Jeep and accidentally interfered with a police task force operation.